Good morning. So as you can tell, I'm no longer in Rishikesh in India, back home in the northern rivers of Australia. In fact, you can see the sand dredge which behind me, which dredges the sand from the mouth of the Tweed River and intermittently pumps it out onto the beaches here, and the tide takes it up north, which helps keep the beaches sandy and maintains some of the great surf breaks of the world, particularly Snapper Rocks, which is just on the other side of the sand dredge there. So, yep, no longer in Rishikesh, which was an extraordinary journey for me, which I went to after the Wilderness Medicine Conference in Mont Blanc, France, Italy and Switzerland. After Rishikesh, I went to Vrindavan in India, which is about an hour and a half drive north of Delhi, and the birthplace of Krishna in the Vedantic literature, celebrated in the Bhagavad Gita, of course. And it's a very different experience to the foothills of the Himalayas. And I was fortunate, in speech marks, in some ways, to be there in the month of celebration of Krishna's birth, which meant that Vrindavan was absolutely packed with celebrations. Packed with monkeys, because I think there's as many monkeys in Vrindavan. But one of the highlights was the ISKCON temple, which is the temple for the Krishna movement, and the Govinda's restaurant there was just next level good. It was just absolutely sensational. I went there to eat every night, and because I was doing yoga every day, there wasn't the quality of the yogashalas there that I wanted. So this is a picture of me on the top of the hotel that I was staying at doing my yoga, because all my yoga friends had dispersed around the world. So because I wanted to keep doing it every day, I took my yoga mat up to the top of the building and do yoga up there every night. And I was in Rishikesh primarily to improve my yoga and meditation, which is not really the correct term, because yoga we think of as the asanas, the physical exercise part, but that's only an absolute microscopic part of yoga. In fact, yoga is an umbrella term for the whole group of technologies, ranging from Vedantic philosophy to meditation to Jyotish, which is Vedic astrology, Ayurveda, and the asana part, the physical exercise component of the umbrella term of yoga. And the asanas really, if you read Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, asanas an incredibly small part of the Yoga Sutras, and really the whole idea of the physical postures of yoga was for us to be able to maintain posture during meditation for a lot longer, so we can get a much more successful meditation. And in fact, in all my time in Rishikesh, well, my asana practice improved dramatically. But what really made a massive impact for me that I wasn't expecting was learning to meditate properly. And in fact, the meditation has become a non-negotiable for me. It doesn't matter what's going in my life or how much sleep I got. I get up at anywhere between 4 or 5 in the morning, which is known in India as Brahma Muhurta, which is the auspicious time during the day to do your meditation practice. We'll talk a little bit more about why that might be during this video. So I'm a little late down here this morning. It's not the usual sunrise time because I've been at home doing my meditation. I haven't missed a day of meditation since I started on the course. And what I really learned about meditation was there's 3 phases. The first phase is the involuntary thought phase, which is the monkey mind, where we realize that we're often not really in control of our mind and it can run the show for us. So phase 1 is recognizing that the involuntary brain activity is natural, but if we want to meditate properly and get the benefits of meditation, we want to download the information that is the ultimate goal of meditation, then we have to turn off that monkey mind. That's where we use mantras and kriyas to switch off that involuntary brain activity. So the next phase after involuntary brain activity is stillness. That's where everything kind of goes black and you get that incredible feeling of peace. And the final third stage is the stage of increased consciousness or cosmic consciousness. And in my opinion, and the opinion of many people, that's where the download happens, where you'll might hear or see things, particularly geometric patterns, and known as the increased consciousness or cosmic consciousness phase, but really it's the bliss and joy stage, where I think that we're using our mitochondria to communicate with a cosmic consciousness, because mitochondria, as we know, are both receivers and transmitters of information, including biophotons and electromagnetic frequencies, which is what we're going to be talking about during this talk today. The other thing I learned about meditation was you really need 4 things to do it properly. You need technique, so you need to learn from somebody who's mastered it. You need the correct sequence to do it in the right order. If we're doing anything in the wrong order, including making a cake, it's probably not going to come out as well as you'd hope. We need technique, we need sequence. Third thing we need is practice. Just remember the Matrix movie where Neo gets his great download of information, utters the famous line, "I know Kung Fu." But of course, when he had to fight Morpheus just because he downloaded all the information, that without the practice, still didn't know how to use the technology properly. So we need technique, sequence, we need practice, and finally, we need optimal mitochondrial function. Because, in my opinion, the opinion of many people, it's the mitochondria which are the receivers of this information. Because remember, mitochondria, 1 quadrillion in our body, highest concentration in areas of increased activity, including muscles, but particularly the heart and the brain. And that's what's receiving the information. And if our mitochondria, if their matrix, the special water inside them, is full of nanoplastics and pesticides have disrupted the electron flow in the mitochondrial membrane, then we're just not going to be able to receive and interpret that information properly. Reminds me of another wilderness medicine conference when I went to, this was 2017, an amazing year for me. And I went to wilderness medicine conference in, it was Northern California, in the Klamath River, where I was learning to fish. It was in my self-sufficiency stage when I had my farm and I wanted to learn to fish as well. And I got there, I flew into Oregon and then drove down to Northern California, only to get beside this beautiful, beautiful, stunning river. But our accommodation was some fixed tents, some permanent tents beside the river. And I got there to find that the inside of the tents, all of them, were covered in mold. And a few years earlier I'd recovered, and I've spoken about this quite a lot, from a mold illness, serious mold illness. And I wasn't very keen to revisit any of those old problems. So I decided I would sleep outside the tent in my sleeping bag, only to discover that during the night black bears would roam through the campsite. So I had to decide whether or not I was going to battle mold or battle the black bears at night. So I went with the mold, ended up with bad fungal ear infections, which took a long time for me to get better. But interestingly, it really reduced my hearing dramatically, down to about 20% of what it is normally. And I just found that life was so much more difficult for me, not being able to communicate with people properly, let alone downloading information from the cosmic consciousness. So just a really good lesson for me at how careful we have to be at maintaining the acuity of our senses, which extraordinary part of life: vision, hearing, touch, smell. So today we're going to be talking about my ongoing hypothesis involving the mitochondria and their relevance as a sense organ. And my hypothesis, as you know, briefly summarized, is that science and spirituality are converging, not diverging. Number two, mitochondria are both receivers and transmitters of information as biophotons and electromagnetic frequencies with a creative intelligence. Part three is that environmental toxins damage the mitochondria, impairing their ability to communicate. And part four is there are solutions to all of those problems that improve our ability to communicate through our mitochondria. And of course, finally in this talk, we're going to talk a little bit about gold, because my hypothesis there is that artificial intelligence, quantitative easing, which is money printing, and the Cantillon effect, which I'll explain later on, are causing massive economic problems that we need to take some action over. All right, so let's talk about mitochondria first. So last week we were talking about eukaryotes, how they come from this alliance between an archaic organism, an archaea, which are extremophile bacteria, which have some few features of eukaryote cells, but are primarily bacteria, and live in extreme environments like oil under the earth's crust, and geothermal boiling hot water, and sludge at the bottom of the ocean. And archaea are anaerobic organisms. They don't use oxygen. They use hydrogen and carbon dioxide to produce energy. And by doing so, they produce methane as a byproduct, which is why they're called methanogens. And they developed an alliance with a different sort of bacteria, where they ingested that bacteria in an endosymbiosis event, which is what we're going to talk about today. So methanogens have changed slightly from typical bacteria. They're atypical bacteria. And they're atypical in the fact that they lost their cell wall. So remember, bacteria have a cell wall and a cell membrane to give them structural stability, whereas eukaryote cells like us, we don't have the cell wall, we use a cytoskeleton. So archaea also have a cytoskeleton and no cell wall, which means antibiotics like penicillin, which attack the cell wall, won't be very effective for them. They also wrapped their DNA in a nuclear membrane, and they developed a cytoskeleton to compensate for the fact that they didn't have a cell wall. And what getting rid of the cell wall allowed them to do was phagocytose, which means they could envelop food, because if you've got a stiff cell wall, you can't wrap yourself around food particles. If you've got a soft cell membrane, you can use that to wrap yourself around food particles, take the food inside you and digest it inside you. Whereas bacteria have to use fermentation, where they excrete products which breaks down food outside them and then they absorb them. So it was a radical change for the archaea in terms of their ability to phagocytose, which means, according to science, they were then able to phagocytose another bacteria. So the original cell was an archaea. Now we have to work out which was the cell that the archaea was able to phagocytize, which then went on to become the mitochondria, according to science. And this is where it starts to get controversial and remains controversial, because there are still lots of problems with the hypothesis of how this happened. So the proposed sequence is that this methanogen anaerobic organism phagocytizes a normal bacteria, a bacteria which loves oxygen and uses oxygen to produce energy. And that bacteria must have been a parasitic bacteria, because it was able to survive inside another cell, which is what parasites do. Because otherwise, the methanogen would have ingested it and dissolved it like it did with other food sources. So the leading candidate for the original cell is the methanogen. And interestingly, the leading candidate for the parasitic cell would be a bacteria very much like today's rickettsia, which are the bacteria which are spread by tick bites. So there's a mutual benefit if the parasite can survive. It gets a delivered food supply to it from the methanogen doing all the hard work, and the methanogen gets a benefit because the bacteria is using oxygen to produce energy, as well as the fermentation process from the methanogen. So it's now got a double source of energy, gets a lot more energy. The puzzle is, however, is why the methanogen didn't digest and destroy the parasitic rickettsial organism. And also, you've got two opposing philosophies of energy production. The methanogen hates oxygen, hates it, like can't survive in an oxygen environment, which is why it sits at the bottom of the ocean and sits in giant collections of fossilized fuel known as oil, uses carbon dioxide and hydrogen to produce energy, whereas the rickettsial parasitic organism loves oxygen and uses oxygen. Well, the problem is then, how does the methanogen get into a situation where it's going to find a rickettsial organism, because they hang out in different parts of the world, and how is the rickettsia not going to destroy the methanogen by bringing in lots of oxygen to use, and how is the methanogen not going to digest the rickettsial organism? So these are all problems we haven't yet discovered an answer to, because as we've discussed, when these problems were worked out by chance once in 15 billion years, what it allowed was two extraordinary things. One, it allowed the methanogen to explore more oxygenated areas, because apparently the rickettsial organism would suck up all the oxygen and protect the methanogen from it. And so methanogens can now move out of ocean goop and explore other more oxygenated areas, because the world's environment was increasing in oxygen at this stage. So methanogens can move. And secondly, and most importantly perhaps, it allows multicellular life, because remember, bacteria are unicellular, they're one cell, and that's because they are limited in energy production. Because, and this is what we're going to talk about next week, we're going to start talking about the proton motor force, where every living cell on the planet uses the same mechanism to produce energy, called the proton motor force. The problem for bacteria is that because of their cell wall, they push the protons across their cell membrane outside their bodies. And because of their surface area to volume ratio, they're very limited in how much they can do. So basically bacteria for 3 billion years have stayed as unicellular organisms because they're limited by energy production. Now the fact with eukaryotes that they were able to internalize their energy production by the formation of 1 quadrillion mitochondria in our body means that they could produce a lot more energy, because every cell in our bodies contains 300 to 400 mitochondria versus a bacterial cell which has to pump hydrogen across its own cell membrane eukaryotes pump hydrogen across the inner mitochondrial membrane of 1 quadrillion energy producing cellular components in our body. So in the next video, we're going to get into the really exciting stuff, because we've kind of done the background information on where mitochondria are thought to have come from, or remember, midichlorians if you're a Jedi, happen to be a Jedi Knight. So we now know the scientific theory for where mitochondria have come from, which allowed multicellular life. Now we're going to look at how mitochondria actually work and how their function might be impaired. That's going to be starting in the next video. So next I want to talk about some scientific research which has just come out this week, which is relevant to mitochondrial science. And remember, none of this is medical health advice. Make sure you read this. Stunning day down here. We had a big storm yesterday, but it's absolutely stunning today. The first study I'm talking about is a recent study which came out last week showing that mycotoxins from fungi disrupt the brain's circadian rhythm. Now, anybody who's had a mold illness obviously has experienced brain fog, but now we know how it happens, because it's a bit like constantly disrupting the time in New York. Well, what's going to happen in New York? Utter chaos if you don't know what time it is, for the rubbish to be collected and the shops to open, go and get a meal. Utter chaos. But that's what mycotoxins do to the brain's circadian rhythm, completely disrupts it. So the brain has no idea what time of day it is or night, and therefore all its functions get completely mixed up. Which then leads on to the second really interesting study, which has shown that in Alzheimer's disease, one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease is loss of the circadian rhythm of the brain. Now, circadian rhythm is absolutely essential to mitochondrial function because of producing energy, producing melatonin, which we've discussed previously. But now we know that the brain of people with Alzheimer's disease has got a disrupted circadian rhythm, which ultimately means that the clearance of the inflammation and plaque that occurs in Alzheimer's disease doesn't happen properly. Also interestingly, that we've talked before about how it's heat shock proteins which help repair the damaged proteins in the brain, or if the cells are irreparably damaged, the heat shock proteins break the cells down and get rid of them, which means loss of brain cells. So in summary, mycotoxins impair the brain circadian rhythm, and in Alzheimer's disease, one of the cardinal features is disruption of the circadian rhythm of the brain, which means the abnormal proteins are not cleared properly in the brain. And remember, all these studies I'll screenshot and put at the end of the video. The final study was a study about migraine. We've known for a long time that mitochondrial dysfunction increases the risk and frequency of migraines, and this study came out and showed that if you take some mitochondrial supplements, particularly vitamin B12 and vitamin B3, you get a much reduced incidence of migraine. Remember, none of this is my opinion. I'm just some dude who likes walking on the beach and doing yoga. Make sure you see the medical disclaimer at the end of the video. Now, what does B12 do? Well, B12 helps break down food. Remember, food is primarily just a source of electrons for the mitochondria. The electrons get converted into, well, help produce ATP for our energy. But we have to extract the electrons from the food, and that's done in what's called the Krebs cycle, and B12 is essential for the optimal functioning of the Krebs cycle. And vitamin B3 converted to NADH, which is an electron carrier, because you have to carry those electrons along the inner mitochondrial membrane. And NADH carries electrons from cytochromes 1 and 2 onward to cytochrome 3 where coenzyme Q10 takes over as an electron transporter. And it has relevance to NAD supplementation because it's at cytochrome 1 where you get the leakage of electrons and free radicals, which can damage the mitochondria if your flow along the electron transport chain is compromised. So if you've forgotten about that, I'd suggest having a look at that video I did on NAD and the mitochondria. And finally, I want to talk about gold. Not because I'm a financial expert, because I'm completely useless with finances, but just because I'm interested in it for a number of reasons. And I watched a great video the other day by Frank Justra, which I'll see if I can put the link into my YouTube video. And Frank talks a lot about the economic problems facing the world today, which are basically the advent of AI, which will take a lot of jobs, quantitative easing, which is printing money, and when you print money you end up with massive inflation, which we're all experiencing now because it's very hard to go out for a meal at a restaurant anymore. And also the Cantillon effect. Now the Cantillon effect is an effect of money printing, because when money is printing, a few people at the very top of the pecking order get access to that money first and get to use that money to make more money. By the time the rest of the money that's left over gets to the general population, there's not a lot of money left. And the little money that they do end up getting extra is taken away by the fact that money printing, the quantitative easing, has caused massive inflation. So yeah, you might get an extra $5 in your pocket a week because of the quantitative easing, but inflation takes $20 out of your pocket at the same time. So that's the Cantillon effect. He also talked a lot about the problems which were coming because of changing of the financial system in the world, because with the US now and $37 trillion in debt and increasing their debt by $2 trillion every year, which is just an unimaginable amount of money, that the financial system is invariably going to change. And if you don't know about mBridge, you should have a look, but that's where China is using an alternative system to the US dollar, where with mBridge they use Chinese CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, which are backed by gold. So you can't just make more of them if you don't have the gold to back it up, which is why China has accumulated so much gold in the last few years. But that means with mBridge you don't get the quantitative easing effect. And not only did the increasing world debt cause mBridge to be started, which will probably replace the concept of the BRICS currencies having their own currency. That will be too difficult, so they will probably use the mBridge philosophy in competition to the US dollar, and the US won't want that to happen. And not only did mBridge happen in response to quantitative easing and massive world inflation, it's also happened in response to Russia having $3 billion of its assets frozen and used for, not only frozen, but the interest on that $3 billion taken by other countries is being used by them. So not only has Russia lost its access to its $3 billion, those $3 billion are being given to another country to use, and also the interest that is earned off that $3 billion. That's caused a lot of other countries to panic, and they want a more secure system of securing their assets, which is also why the Shanghai Gold Exchange is being run out in multiple countries, where you can trade and buy your own precious metals, particularly gold, silver and platinum. So I'd suggest, if you want to know what's happening in the world financially, you have a look into mBridge, have a look into the Shanghai Gold Exchange, have a look at the Cantillon effect, have a look at quantitative easing, and have a look at Frank Justra's video about what he thinks are some of the solutions to the invariable financial crisis and change in the world financial system, particularly in terms of gold, because as Russia and China start using gold-backed CBDCs instead of the US dollar, their financial transactions are going to start happening completely outside Western countries, and a lot of people are not going to be very happy with that. So because of all those problems, there's a new financial system coming for the world, but nobody's really going to want to start it. And usually history has shown that new financial systems only get implemented when there's enough motivation to do so, which is usually because of world conflict. So I find that video with Frank Justra really informing and helps me decide on a strategy going forward. All right, that's enough for me today. I'm losing my voice again from shouting because of the ocean noise. Always remember though, that no matter how much it hurts, how dark it gets, or how far you fall, you are never out of the fight. And also remember that where there's no doubt, there's no fear. Embrace radical optimism. If you like the video, make sure you give it a like on YouTube, share the video, helps get the message out there, and I'll see you next week to discuss, when my voice comes back, the proton motive force. Namaste, peace and love from me. See you next week, bye. And as promised, here's a look at some of the foods that I'm growing at my small suburban property. Pomegranate, aloe of course, pomegranate, different stages of growth. These ones have been in for a couple of years. As you can see, starting to develop some amazing pomegranates, what I think is the most medicinal fruit on the planet. This one's been in longest, and you can see how well they're going and how beautiful the pomegranate fruit is. And remember, not only are the roots medicinal, according to the scientific literature, not according to me, as are the leaves and the peel of the fruit and the juice of the fruit. And as I said last week, when I trim the hedges or trim the pomegranate hedge, I take off the leaves and dehydrate them, and then I use the pomegranate sticks for my smoker when I decide to smoke something. More pomegranate. Oh, and here's the weed tea. So that's weeds from the garden and flowers from the garden which are falling off, which go into the rainwater and soak for a week or so, making a tea which I then put on as a fertilizer for the pomegranate hedge. And over the next few weeks I'll show you the other natural fertilizers I'm using for the garden. So big emphasis of mine now is to, hello butterfly, is to grow my own food and medicines on my own property. In fact, if it's not giving me food, I'm going to be replaced with something that does give me food. As the economy gets harder and harder, I want to be providing myself with my own food source and liaising with other people doing the same, so we can swap some foods, because I think that's where we're going to have to go for a few years until this financial stuff's all sorted out. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye. And remember that after nearly 6 years I remain suspended in nutritional environmental medicine and can only work as an emergency specialist in a public hospital. So none of this is health or medical advice, and certainly does not replace a professional relationship with your own healthcare provider. And just because I go jumping in freezing cold water doesn't mean anybody else should without adequate training in the hormetic principles of contrast therapy.